Chapter 1 of Fairy Tales from South Africa. Fairy Tales from South Africa, collected and arranged by Mrs E. J. Burhill and Mrs J. B. Drake. Setuli, or the King of the Birds, a Swazi tale. Many, many years ago there lived a poor man named Setuli, who was deaf and dumb. He had never been able to speak or to understand anything but signs from his birth, and was despised by all his brothers and sisters. Although he was the son of a powerful chief, no one so much as looked at him, and he could never hope to win a bride or have a home of his own. He had but one friend, an elder brother, who gave him food and shelter, and was always kind to him. This brother was already old, and was known as a great magician. He knew the properties of every herb, and the wonderful powers possessed by birds and beasts. When he went to search for magic roots, he always took Setuli with him, for he found his eyes were quicker than those of any man in the countryside, and his fingers more deft. One day in spring, when the first rains had fallen and green shoots were showing among the dry grass, the two brothers went out to gather roots as usual. They travelled far into the mountains till they reached a narrow valley full of trees just bursting into leaf. A clear stream ran down one side among great boulders. Ferns were just uncurling their early fronds, and in sheltered nooks big scarlet daisies shone like tiny suns. The old magician and Setuli set to work at once, for here many rare plants flourished. They had been at work an hour or more when a swarm of beautiful black birds with long waving tails came towards them, flying in a zigzag course. They settled on the low bushes, swinging up and down on the branches, and balancing their long tails. The two brothers both looked up, and in a grave voice the old magician said to the birds, "Sakobulas, we go to sleep, and we get up as we used to do." This was the magic greeting they expected. I cannot tell you what it meant, but when the Sakobulas heard it, they flew away quite satisfied. The two brothers went on digging and moved further up the stream. Then a great swarm of dear little rooibekkies suddenly appeared, tiny little brown birds with pink breasts and bright red bills. They fluttered all round, chattering gaily. The old magician again looked up. "Mantisane," said he, "we go to sleep, and we get up as we used to do." And the rooibekkies flew away quite satisfied. Then the two brothers went on digging again, and worked for a long time. All at once there rushed upon them an immense flight of the most beautiful birds, shining from head to foot with glorious yellow plumage. Round their necks showed a ring of velvety black, and there were black feathers in their wings. "Follow us up! Follow us up!" they cried to the two brothers. "These are orioles," said the old magician. "Without doubt some great adventure is before us." He signed to his brother to leave the roots and follow the birds. They travelled over the mountains for 3 days and 3 nights, following the golden birds. On the morning of the 4th day, the birds led them down a steep mountainside to a deep green valley through which ran a wide stream. The birds followed the stream till they came to a deep, clear pool under the shadow of great trees. It was very cool and very still. Tall reeds and big white lilies grew all round the water's edge, and over the pool itself were hundreds of water lilies, white and purple. The golden birds turned to the magician and said, Bring your brother here and tell him on no account to be afraid, no matter what may happen to him. He must wait by the edge of the pool amongst the reeds and lilies." The elder brother fetched Setuli and made him understand what was wanted of him. Then he went away and left his brother alone, wondering what this new adventure would bring. Now, though Setuli had always been despised and set aside by all his relations, he was in reality both wise and brave. He sat down at the water's edge and remained perfectly still. Suddenly the waters moved, and up rose a huge alligator. It came straight towards him, lashing its great tail and opening its huge jaws. Its teeth glistened in the sun, and as it walked up the bank, it snapped at Setuli and blinked its wicked little eyes. But Setuli sat perfectly still and pretended not to notice. The alligator thrust its long nose almost in his face, snapped its jaws once more, and then, seeing he showed no sign of fear, turned tail and slipped into the pool again. Setuli remained sitting, waiting to see what would happen next. For a little while the pool was still. Then the whole of the waters moved, and out came a huge ogre, far more hideous and terrible than the alligator. He was covered with eyes and glared with every one of them at the deaf man. Then he roared fiercely and sprang towards him. But still Setuli did not move so much as an eyelid. The ogre shouted again and then disappeared, like the alligator before him. After that there was no sound or motion for many hours. Setuli sat watching by the pool. Just as he began to think nothing more would happen, the waters moved quietly, and out came a fairy in the shape of an old woman. She stood in the waters up to her waist and gazed at Setuli. On her right hand there perched a beautiful black sakobula, and on her left hand a little rooibekkie, and on her head was a most wonderful aureole, bright as the rising moon. The old woman continued to gaze at Setuli and said 3 times in a loud voice, "Speak!" When she uttered the 3rd word, Setuli felt a new power had come to him. He could speak like other people, and he could understand all the fairy said. "Go to your brother," said she, "and show him you are cured. I have known both of you long, and have determined to help you. Whatever you want in the future, you shall receive. You have only to ask for it." The fairy vanished, and the 3 birds flew away. Setuli soon found his brother, and the old man's astonishment was great when he heard the deaf man speak. Setuli, in his turn, was much surprised to find the 3 swarms of birds again, just as he had left them on his journey out. They flew in 3 separate companies, and at the head of each company was one more beautiful than the others, evidently the leader. Setuli soon saw these were the very birds who had accompanied the fairy. No doubt she had sent them for his use. He thought deeply for a time, and then made new plans. The result you shall soon hear. The 2 brothers journeyed on till they saw a great storm rising. The sky was blue-black, and a noise could be heard like continuous thunder. "That is hail," cried the magician. "We shall be caught here in the open. Nothing can save us from death." "Do not fear," said Setuli. "Wait, and you shall see." He gave a command, and instantly 1,000 huts appeared. His brother gazed in astonishment and delight. Then he said, "What do we want with so many huts? There is no one to shelter but you and me." "I shall want huts for my soldiers and people," said Setuli. Then he turned to the companies of birds and changed them all with one word into warriors. The Sakobulas became his first regiment. They were great tall men clad in leopard skins, holding in their hands assegais and huge shields of ox hide. But one thing remained of their former state. Each man wore on his head a huge cap of the long tail feathers of the sakobula. Footnote: assegais, small light spears of which natives usually carry several. An assegai can be thrown as a dart or used like a spear at close quarters. End of footnote. They stood in line, saluted their chief, and marched to their huts. Then came the golden orioles. These were Setuli's bodyguard, and were even finer than the sakobulas. Their skins were of the silver jackal. Round their knees and arms were bracelets of white ox-tails, and on their heads were long black ostrich plumes. Before them stood the golden oriole, bright as the rising moon, now the general in command next to Setuli himself. Last of all came the rooibekkies. These became the little umfans, the lads who carry all the baggage of the army and wait on the grown men. Setuli sent them all to their huts just as the first hailstones struck the ground. For an hour no one stirred. The sound of the storm was like continuous roaring thunder. The hailstones were as large as great plums, jagged and sharp as crystals. Every tree was stripped of its leaves, and all birds and beasts who could not find shelter were killed or maimed. When the storm ceased, the hail lay in icy heaps in every hollow, and the air was frosty and cold as in midwinter on the high mountains. A raw mist rose from the valleys, but Setuli felt no cold. His heart was great within him, for now he had proved his powers. He called out his troops once more and reviewed them with joy and pride. "We shall go forth and conquer a great kingdom," he said to his brother. "I shall yet be a rich man." The regiments shouted "Bayeta," the salute which is given only to the chief, and swore to follow wherever Setuli led. Generals were appointed for each division of the army, the 3 leaders being the birds who sat on the fairies' hands. There was no trouble about provisions or shelter, for Setuli had only to ask for food, and there was abundance for all. He now determined to search for a kingdom to conquer. He left the country of mountains and wooded valleys, and went up to the great tableland to search for new people to overcome. He travelled with his army for a year, but never saw so much as one little hut. The land was empty. On every side was waving grass, extending as far as the eye could reach. But no path appeared, nor any tree. Great herds of buck sometimes came towards them, and then followed fine hunting. But no man or woman could they find, though they travelled for many months. At last they turned back towards the low country, and at the end of a year they came to a range of mountains overlooking an immense plain. Below they saw great cities surrounded by fields full of mealies. Thousands of cattle roamed on the hills. They had but to descend and seize all they wanted. Footnote: mealies, the name generally used in South Africa for Indian corn or maize. End of footnote. Setuli bade his men camp in a great valley which could not be seen from the plain. Then he sent spies to find out how strong the cities were and how big was the king's army. But first his brother, the magician, gave them a wonderful potion which made them invisible, so that no one should suspect them. In the evening they returned in great fear. "The people," cried they, "are all deaf and dumb. They have but one arm and walk on one leg only. Not only that, but as soon as we approached them, we found we were becoming deaf and dumb also, so we ran back as quickly as possible." This troubled Setuli very much. "Don't go near these people," he said. "Let us get right away from the towns and go hunting in the mountains." Now Setuli was very wise, and had besides the advice of his brother, the great magician. He had determined to take possession of all the inhabitants of this country and drive away all their cattle, but he felt sure some powerful monster ruled over them, who would first have to be discovered and destroyed. The only thing to do was to devise some means of attracting him to the camp and killing him unawares. A big hunt was arranged, and an immense number of birds were taken of all shapes and colours. Setuli drew a feather out of the tail of every bird and made a huge many-coloured ball, which he wore as a headdress and as a protection for himself, for magic power was in the feathers. Then he allowed preparations to be made for the great feast which followed the hunt, but gave special directions to his men. "Do not eat all the birds," he said. "Place half of those you have killed in front of the huts. Put first a whole bird, then the head of a bird you have eaten, in long rows all round the camp, and then put a treble row about my own hut." The men carried out these commands carefully, and soon the whole camp was surrounded with dead birds of every hue and shape. When all the feasting was over and the camp quite still, Setuli crept out of his hut and hid behind the screen which sheltered the entrance. It was full moon, and the country shone like silver. Sharp inky black shadows showed near the river where the bushes grew, and round each hut was a dark narrow ring in which no object was visible. Setuli crouched behind his screen of reeds. The camp was absolutely still and deserted. Towards midnight he heard heavy footsteps approaching. Every now and then they stopped. Then they began again. Setuli stooped lower. Without doubt the monster who owned all the cities in the plain was approaching. The footsteps were not even. They resembled someone hopping very heavily. Presently a huge black figure came in sight, holding a long assegai. He had but one leg and one arm, and stopped greedily at every hut to eat the birds which lay there. As he came nearer, Setuli saw that he was of unimaginable ugliness. His eyes were divided. One was in the middle of his forehead, and the other at the back of his head, so that whichever way he stood he saw you, and you could not escape him. At the entrance of Setuli's hut he stopped, gave a snarl of delight at the sight of so many birds, and sat down to enjoy them. He had but one arm, so he laid his assegai down just before the door-screen. Setuli asked for no better chance. He rose quickly, seized the assegai, and stabbed the monster in the neck. He rolled over with a groan and lay quite still, apparently dead. With a joyous heart Setuli roused all his men, and at break of day led them into the great plain. To their surprise they found the people walking on two legs and talking as well as themselves. The death of the ogre relieved the people from the bonds of a wicked enchantment, and they were only too glad to go with Setuli and his men, they and all their cattle. By evening all was in order for the march, and at earliest dawn the company started for the mountains. They had gone a whole day's journey, and had reached a point high above the great plain, when Setuli discovered that he had lost his ball of feathers. He did not wish to turn his followers back, but neither could he bear to travel farther without his headdress, for it had magic power, and it might be long before he could get such another. So he bade his army go on under the leadership of his brother, and went down the mountain paths as fast as possible, till he came to the valley in which they had camped. There he saw a sight which made his heart stand still. The ogre whom he had left for dead was sitting up alive and well, and round him danced and romped hundreds of little ogres, all with one leg and one arm like their father. They tossed the magic ball of feathers from one to another, and shouted with glee. Setuli saw he must risk all and trust to his swift feet to get away. He ran in suddenly, seized the ball of feathers, and turned quickly away up the mountain path. As he touched the ball, all the little ogres vanished like smoke. Only the big one remained, and for a moment he was dazed and did not understand what had happened. Then he got up and stamped after Setuli with astonishing speed. It was all Setuli could do to keep the distance between them, but he was strong and knew the paths. They leapt from rock to rock, in and out among the trees, till they came to the grassy slopes which led to the great pass. They climbed all day till the sun began to set. Then, at the very top of the mountain range, Setuli found his army camped along the side of a deep ravine. Below was a valley many hundreds of feet deep, lined with huge rocks and great trees. Beyond, many weary hours away, rose another mountain, with green slopes marked with the course of many streams. "Bayeta!" cried the army when they saw their chief. "My men," cried Setuli, "we have not a moment to lose. Our enemy is behind us, and we shall soon be in his hands. Let every man, woman and child fix his eyes on the mountain side opposite, and then leap with all his might." Setuli could hear his enemy behind him as his people leapt together into the air. He ran forward, touched the cattle with his ball of feathers, and they too jumped with all their might. All landed safely on the other side, and placed the great ravine between them and the terrible ogre. Setuli jumped last, just as the monster, breathless and exhausted, reached the edge of the precipice. Twilight set in, and when the sun rose next morning, Setuli and all his people found themselves in perfect safety, and set forth once more on their journey. They travelled all day, and at sunset came to the most beautiful valley they had ever beheld. It lay far below them, wide, green and fertile. Down its centre flowed a clear stream shaded by great fern trees, and bordered with thick green bushes covered with scarlet flowers. The valley extended as far as the eye could see towards the setting sun. All the hills on either side were closely wooded and well watered. Setuli turned to his brother and said, "This is the finest country I have ever seen. We will settle here with all our men." At the end of the valley was a very large kraal, wherein dwelt the chief of the country. Setuli determined to win him over to his side and make him his man. So he took his bodyguard and marched down the mountain path to the gates of the kraal. Just as they approached the chief's hut, he struck every one of his men on the leg with his magic assegai. They at once began to walk, every man on one leg. "Never have I seen such magic power," said the chief. "You shall be our king and protect us against all our enemies." "I will show you yet more marvels," said Setuli. He struck his men once more, and they all walked like ordinary human beings. While the chief still stared in open-mouthed wonder, he turned to the mountainside and shouted, "Men, appear!" Instantly, from top to bottom of the great hill, stood line upon line of magnificent warriors, clad in leopard skins and holding white shields. They lifted their right hands and shouted, "Bayeta!" so that the cry echoed like thunder from side to side of the valley. Then Setuli shouted once more, "Men, disappear!" and at once the hillside was empty and silent. "You see," said Setuli, "I have men at my command whenever we need them." "You shall certainly be our king," cried all the people. So Setuli and his brother and all the men and women who belonged to them stayed in the valley, and lived in great peace and happiness all their lives long. So ends Setuli, or the King of the Birds. Chapter 2 of Fairy Tales from South Africa, collected and arranged by Mrs. E.B. Burhill and Mrs. J.B. Drake. Once upon a time there lived among the mountains a great king, and he had many cattle which he loved. Among them was a fairy ox with horns which curled right across his forehead, and with a voice like thunder. This ox led the herd, and at his call all the cattle followed him. In the daytime they fed in the tall grass in the valley, and at night they were brought home to the big kraal, round which were the huts of the king and all his men, so that they might be safe from any harm. And the fence of the kraal was strong and high, and the men watched so that no evil befell the cattle. Now the king loved the cattle so much that he made one of his own sons herdsman. Every morning this boy took the cattle to graze in the pasture, and at sunset he drove them back to the kraal. All day in the hot sunshine he watched the herd to see that none strayed and were lost, and to take care that no enemy came in to steal. And because the grass in summer grew tall, high above his head, and thick, so that he could not see, he would climb onto one of the great rocks that lay scattered about the valley. For the rocks were very large, large as a hut, and in the shadow beneath them it was cool, and the little rock ferns grew. But on the top, where the sunlight fell, the little lizards lay and caught flies. Often the boy grew tired as he watched the herds, and longed to lie in the warm sun and sleep. But he dared not, for he feared his father's anger if he should lose him an ox. But it happened one day that as he watched the cattle, a fairy appeared to him in the shape of a very old woman. She came and talked to him, and he told her how he had always watched lest the cattle strayed, and how he feared lest his father's foes should come and kill him and take the cattle. Then the fairy pointed to a stone, smooth and large and round, like a hut that showed up above the grass of the valley. The boy looked, for he had never seen the stone before. "Come," she said, "this is your stone. See, it is so smooth that no one can keep his footing on it or climb it, but you shall be able. As you grow, the stone will grow, and from it you can watch all the valley, and no enemy will be able to hurt you, for they could not climb it. But beware that you do not fall asleep on it, for then all your cattle will be stolen." She also taught him a magic song. "Come, cattle, come, all you cattle, come to me," the melody of which was so enchanting that all the cattle who heard it followed the singer. Then the fairy vanished away. So the boy became a splendid herdsman, and none of his cattle were lost, for every evening he sang to them, and they followed him to the kraal, and none strayed. Nor could any be stolen, for on the rock he watched in safety. But at last one hot day he fell asleep on the rock, and the enemy who were watching saw him sleeping, and crept down from the hills and drove off all the cattle. When he woke up, not one head of cattle could he find. He sang, "Come, cattle, come," but it was in vain. They did not hear him. He wandered about the valley looking and singing till the sun began to set, and then, in shame and fear, went to the kraal alone. He went to his father and told him all, but the old king was very angry and drove him from the kraal, saying, "Never come back unless you bring my cattle with you." So the poor boy wandered back sadly to the valley, and climbed upon the big stone, and lay there in the moonlight crying, for he had lost his cattle, and he had lost his home. And as he lay, someone touched him, and he looked up and saw the old woman, the fairy, who had given him the stone and taught him the charm. "I know what has happened," she said. "You have slept, and what I foretold has come to pass. The cattle are gone." "And I am driven from the kraal till I find them," he said, and cried again. "Do not despair," she said, "but go to the chief who has your cattle, and ask to be his man." So the boy rose, and all night long under the moon he travelled between the grey mountains, up and down by little winding paths between the grass and rocks, through the streams and bushes, till in the morning, when the sun rose, he came to his enemy's kraal, and within it he heard his father's cattle. So he entered the kraal and went to the chief and offered to be his man, and the chief made him herdsman of his own cattle. Every morning he took them out to pasture, and every evening he sang to them the magic song and brought them home, and none strayed and were lost. Thus he served the chief many years, till he was a man full grown. And always he thought of his father's kraal, and looked how he might take the cattle and return. At last the chance came. The great festival of the first fruits was at hand. The women made the beer, placed the calabashes in a row outside the kraal, and on the day appointed, the men and women went out to gather the first ripe maize and Kaffir corn from the lands. And the children went to get wood for the cooking of the feast, and no one was left in the kraal but an old woman and the king's son, who was in charge of the cattle. When all were gone, he took some sango, the herb that intoxicates men and makes them sleep, and powdered it very fine. Then he went to the row of calabashes in which the beer stood waiting for the evening's feast, and put some into each calabash, and went away and waited till all came back. When the chief and his people returned, there was great rejoicing. A hut of green boughs was made for the chief, in which he sat, and the first fruits were all brought to him, and a branch from each offering was tied to his arms or neck. Then his wise men brought him a drink made of herbs, and water from the sea, and gave it to all present as a sign that the feast was to begin. Everyone ate of the new corn and the fresh nuts, and drank of the new beer. Only the king's son drank none. And at last all fell asleep. And when the evening came and the moon rose, not a man or woman was left awake. Then the king's son stood up and climbed on the wall of the cattle kraal, and sang the magic song, "Come, cattle, come to me," and opened the gate of the kraal. At once the cattle rose up and walked straight past the huts and the sleeping men, and out into the country, following the king's son. And as they went, the fairy ox with the crumpled horn bellowed loudly, and at his call all the cattle came from the east and the west and the south, and followed the king's son, and he went towards his father's kraal. When his enemies awoke in the morning, they could not find one head of cattle in their kraal, nor yet in all the surrounding country. The old chief felt sure when he heard this that the king's son had taken them away, and he bade all his men arm themselves and follow the culprit. So his men gathered with their shields of oxhide and their assegais, and finding the path of the oxen, followed it. It did not take them long to overtake the king's son, for the cattle moved slowly. And by the evening of the second day they were in sight of the cattle, and rejoiced over the thought of their capture. The king's son, who saw his enemies moving on the mountain behind him, was in great fear, and knew not what to do, for the cattle could not travel fast. He led them down the mountain along the banks of a little stream where the trees grew, tall thick thorns with yellow flowers like small pincushions, and wild figs with tiny fruit, and tall reeds covered the banks, and from the trees the monkey ropes hung down to the rocks and water, and everywhere grew the fern, and the clear water ran and raced between the stones, slipping from pool to pool, and playing with the leaves and rushes. And the bright flies hung over it in the little ladders of sunlight slanting through the trees. And there the king's son hid his cattle among the bush, and sat in the grass under a big fig tree to think what he should do. But he could think of no way to save the cattle. and the evening drew on, and the shadow rose over the creek and crept up the mountainside, and the frogs began to croak and the crickets to sing, and everywhere was the humming of the gnats. And he sat under the fig tree and looked across the valley to the mountain where his enemies were. And he knew that in the morning they would come and kill him and take his cattle. Footnote: Creek. This word is used in the English-speaking districts of South Africa to denote a narrow gorge in the mountains with a stream running down the middle. As a rule, they are thickly wooded and full of the most lovely ferns. In the Cape Colony, they are called kloofs. End of footnote. A bat flitted round him in the darkness, so near that he looked up, and there before him he saw the fairy. "Do not despair," she said. "Your task is nearly done. Obey me, and all shall be well. Go now and kill a white ox. Skin it, and cut the hide into 10,000 little white shields, and I will find you soldiers." So he slew the ox and skinned it, and made of the hide 10,000 little white shields. Then the fairy cried to the frogs who lived near the stream, sitting under all the stones from the top of the hill to the bottom, and whose voices could be heard all across the valley. "Frogs," she cried, "will you take these shields and do as the king's son bids you?" And from all over the valley they cried, "We will." So the king's son gave them the shields, and all night long he drilled them in the moonlight. When he called, "Woo!" they rose up, shouting with their shields extended, and when he cried, "Boo!" they fell down and lay hidden. Before the dawn, he placed them in a long line on the mountainside, where the enemy would see them. As the first company of the enemy appeared, the frogs rose together, raised their shields, and croaked, "Woo!" with a sound like thunder. So great indeed was the sound that the enemy fell back to their chief in terror. "There is an impi of many thousand men across the creek," they said. "No one can stand against them." The chief then sent a larger company, but they returned with the same tale. Then he went himself with all his army, but when he saw the thousands of white shields and heard the war cry, fear seized his heart. "It is better to return without our cattle than lose our lives," he said, and ordered all to go back home again. Footnote: Impi is a regiment. End of footnote. So the king's son was safe. He thanked the frogs, gathered his cattle together, and reached his father's kraal. The king received him with great honour, gave him a princess for his wife, and made him chief of all his sons. But every night the king's son sang his magic song as before, and kept the cattle in safety. So ends the story of the king's son and the magic song. Chapter 3 of Fairy Tales from South Africa, collected and arranged by Mrs E. J. Burhill and Mrs. J. B. Drake. The story of the little birds who lived in a cave. A Zulu nursery tale. Once upon a time there was a big cave in a hillside, in which lived hundreds of little birds. There were fathers and mothers, and lots of little ones. Each had a little kraal, with a hut no bigger than your hand, and a fence all round, beautifully woven of tiny reeds. One day all the mothers went out to get food, and said to their little ones, "Be very good and quiet, and make the huts clean and tidy, while we hoe the lands." Then they went out to see to their tiny fields in which they grew their food, little mealies and tiny sugar-cane, pumpkins no larger than a nut, and nuts no bigger than grass seeds. The little birds were very good. They swept the huts out beautifully and tidied them up. Then they cleaned little shells ready to cook the food, and got water in tiny leaves. When all was done, they sat down and waited for their parents to arrive. Suddenly a blackbird came to the door of the cave. He had a long, sharp beak and very long claws. He put his head in and cried, "Fur, fur," first to one side and then to the other, in a high, clear voice. All the little birds put their heads out of the tiny huts at once to see who the intruder might be. The big bird then said, "All you little birds must turn out at once. This cave belongs to me." At that, the little birds were very angry. The boldest of them flew straight at the blackbird to turn him out, but he was pecked right in the neck. A little stream of blood appeared, as black as charcoal, and the little bird fell dead. Then the big bird attacked many others. He broke the leg of one, he picked out the eyes of another, he broke the wing of a third. When he had frightened and scattered them all, he flew away. That evening the mother birds came home, but could not make out why the cave was so silent. "What is wrong?" they said. "There is no twittering, no rustling of wings. Something must have happened." Great was their grief when they found one little bird dead and so many others crippled and hurt. "Whoever has done all this?" they cried. Then the little birds told their tale. "It was a wicked bird with black feathers and a long beak. There he is again at the door." The mothers turned round and flew in a body at the marauder, but he just cried, "Fur, fur," and flew straight up in the air far out of their reach. The next day the blackbird came and destroyed all their little lands. Not a blade of mealies or sugar-cane remained. The mothers were in despair, and that evening they said they must leave the cave and find a safer home elsewhere. Suddenly a tiny bird entered the cave, no bigger than your fingernail. He cried, "Tweet, tweet," ever so sweetly, and flew straight to a little bird who was only a hen. "You," said he, "shall kill the blackbird." Everyone cried out that the little bird was not nearly strong enough. "You shall kill him," said the tiny bird. "Fly straight at his head and pick out his eyes. Then you can easily kill him." The little hen took heart of grace and promised to be brave. Next morning the big bird, sure that this time the cave would soon be his, put his head in at the door and called in his high wicked voice, "Fur, fur." Out flew the little hen straight at his head and picked out his eyes before he knew what had happened. Then the fathers and mothers all threw themselves on him, and in a few minutes he was dead. After that, all the families lived in much peace and happiness, and were never troubled any more. So ends the story of the little birds who lived in a cave. Chapter 4 of Fairy Tales from South Africa, collected and arranged by Mrs. E.B. Burhill and Mrs. J.B. Drake. The story of the Shining Princess, a Msuto story. In a green valley far away among the mountains, there was once a most beautiful kraal. The hut was bright green, finely thatched with grass, the floor within of red earth, firm and beautifully polished. All the cooking pots were of red clay and stood in good order round the walls, and with them were shining green calabashes full of milk and cream. Fine green mats lay upon the floor, save in one corner, where there was a little mat woven of mountain grass, the colour of gold. Round the hut was a high green fence, also of exquisite neatness. Indeed, all was in perfect order, and no kraal was kept like it in all the country round. for it was the home of a great chief's wife. Her husband had been dead many years, and had left her all alone in the world with one little girl named Maholia, who was only 3 years old. The queen had been a most beautiful woman in her day, and as the little girl grew up, she was just as lovely as her mother. The greatest care was taken of her, and she was soon as good and obedient as she was charming. Her mother never married again. Indeed, it would not have been fitting, as she had been a king's wife. She lived only for her child, and they loved one another dearly. Maholia was the envy of every little girl in the country. Everything she had was the colour of the golden moon, her necklaces, her bracelets, and the gold circle she wore round her neck. As she grew up, she became more and more noted for her beauty and charm. She was so lovely that she dazzled the eyes of all beholders, and was known as the Shining Princess. Time went on, and when she grew to womanhood, many lovers came forward to ask her in marriage. There was not a chief's son for many days' journey who did not long to make her his wife. But neither the princess herself nor her mother cared for any of them, nor would they hear of marriage. Then one day came an embassy from a very powerful king. He was searching everywhere for a beautiful girl to be his son's wife. But though his wise men had travelled far and wide, and many girls had been brought to his kraal, not one had been found to his mind. He decided to seek yet further afield, and sent his chief Induna, with attendants in great state, to see all the princesses in far countries who were famous for their beauty. Footnote: Induna, a headman or leader under the command of a chief. End of footnote. After many months of travel, the Induna began to hear talk of the Shining Princess. He decided to visit her, though he feared to be disappointed once more. But at the sight of the green kraal, his hopes rose. At the door the princess met him. She was shining from head to foot in the bright sun. Round her neck were thick bars of red gold copper. Copper and brass rings adorned her shapely arms from wrist to elbow, and appeared again on her slender ankles, reaching almost to her knees. Round her waist was a girdle of golden beads, twisted into a thick rope behind, and in front hanging in a long glistening fringe over her short apron of skin. This was again embroidered in squares with gold and copper beads. Over her pretty shoulders hung her cloak, also embroidered in circles of gold and bordered with a wide band of shining beads. Even her snuff calabash was gold-coloured, of jackal skin. Every movement was full of grace, and her laughing lips and bright eyes showed the kindness of her heart. When the Induna saw this beautiful woman clad in gold and shining like the rising moon, he said, "This is the princess I have been seeking. This is indeed the wife for our great king's son." He begged to see Maholia's mother, and formally demanded the hand of her daughter. Many days passed in discussion. The queen was loath to part with her child, but the Induna talked so wisely of his master's power and riches, and the bravery and wisdom of the bridegroom, that she at last consented. The embassy then returned home to the king, and told him with great joy of the beauty and goodness of the Shining Princess. The king bade his chief rest while he gathered together the marriage gift of cattle for the queen mother. These consisted of 100 beautiful animals, at the head of which marched a fairy ox. He was magnificent, the king's great pride, but he was considered only due payment for so fair a princess. He was black as charcoal, save for 2 long white horns, and between his shoulders burned a steady light, which illuminated his path by night, and gave him magic power. When all was ready, the wedding party set out to fetch the bride and deliver the tribute due to her mother. The queen was delighted with the cattle, and especially with the fairy ox. "Here," she said to her daughter, "take this ox with you. He is my present to you. Your journey will be long, and you will often be glad to ride him." Then she turned to the king's men and said, "Do not leave my daughter alone. I am afraid of what may happen to her. If you leave her, I shall know at once, for the corner in which she has always sat at home will crumble away." The wedding party promised faithfully to guard Maholia with every care. The princess and her mother parted with bitter tears, and she and her attendant maids set forth with the king's men. For 2 days all went well, but on the 3rd day the men came upon hundreds of buck of every kind, large and small, and behind these appeared great herds of elephant and giraffe. The country was full of game. The king's men could not resist the temptation and started off to hunt. Such abundance they had never seen in their lives before. In the end, even the girls joined their party, and all were soon in hot pursuit. The shining princess was left all alone, seated on an ant-heap, the fairy ox by her side. That very moment, as her mother sat in the hut thinking anxiously of her absent child, the corner on which the golden mat had lain cracked from end to end and crumbled away. In the meantime, the wedding party went on gaily hunting. The further they went, the more fresh buck appeared. They forgot all about the bride and continued the chase for days. The poor bride sat alone till she was discovered by a party of cannibals, who seized her and carried her away. They endeavoured also to secure the fairy fox, but he gave one great leap into the air out of the midst of the enemy, and flew like the wind to the princess's mother. The poor queen met him at the kraal gate, for well she knew some evil had befallen her daughter. The great ox stood still while she knelt before him and heard his tale. "But where is she now?" cried the queen. "Where have they taken her?" "That is all I know," said the ox. "The cannibals took her, and so I came with all speed to you. But do not despair, all will yet be well." Meanwhile the king and his son waited and waited for the expected bride. Weeks and months passed by, and they began to fear some great calamity. Then, one by one, their men straggled in. They told their story in great shame. They had left the princess and forgotten her. They could not find her again, though they had travelled far and wide. The king had them all put to death. Then he called his chiefs together and asked their advice. They all decided that the bridegroom himself must go with a body of picked men and search for the bride in her mother's home. The queen received them with much joy, but her grief was great when she heard they knew nothing of her daughter. She told them of the return of the fairy ox and all his tale. "Be of good cheer," said the prince. "I will take the fairy ox myself, and will never return till I can bring your daughter with me." Then the prince took the ox and set forth on his journey. He travelled for weeks and months, but no trace of the princess could he find. One day he came to a marula tree covered with shining yellow fruit. "This would be good to make cider," said the prince. "I will eat some." He had scarcely eaten a few berries when a deep voice came out of the tree. "What do you want?" it asked. "I seek for the shining princess," said the prince. "Am I on the right way?" "Go on," said the marula, "till you come to the big fig tree." The prince journeyed yet further among country overgrown with bush, till by the side of a stream he came to an immense tree covered with little red figs. They even grew on the roots, and its leaves were so thick that no sun could pierce them. He sat down in its deep shade and said, "I seek the shining princess. Am I on the right way?" "Go on," said the fig tree, "till you come to a big river. Beyond it lies a great forest, and in that forest you will find the princess." The prince started forth full of joy and followed the course of the stream. The next day he found himself in full view of a deep river. It was in flood, and so wide that he could not hope to cross it. "Climb on my back," said the fairy ox. "I will carry you over." The prince did as he was told, and the ox plunged into the water, swam across, and then flew like the wind over a huge plain. In the far distance they saw the forest. Every hour it grew larger, till at last they reached its outskirts, when the prince found the trees were taller and thicker than any he had ever seen. He could find no path at all, and the trees met over his head, so that only a dim light filtered through. High ferns grew on every side, and here and there he crossed tiny streams fringed with maidenhair. He wandered on for hours without so much as seeing the sun, always hoping to find some open glade. At last, far away, he saw a shining pool of water. So he went forward, guided by the distant shimmer through the trees. As he drew nearer, he saw that the pool was surrounded by reeds. One tall reed stood quivering in the middle. The gleam of the water grew yet brighter and more golden, till, as he burst through the last thicket, he found it was no pool at all, but the shining princess herself, seated in a circle of tall grass. The prince hailed her with delight, for never had he hoped to find such beauty. As for Maholia, she knew at once that this was her lover. No one else could have shown such skill and bravery. Besides, the fairy ox was there once more, the light between his shoulders burning bright with joy. There they sat for hours among the fern, telling one another of all their wanderings. Maholia, it seemed, had been taken by the cannibals to the edge of the great forest, for they were travelling towards the country of their king, which lay in that direction. One dark night she escaped them, and had lived ever since in the midst of the great bush. When she had told her tale, the prince had to relate his adventures, and then he told the princess how beautiful she was, and how well worth every danger, and that she wanted to hear over and over again. Indeed, they might never have left the forest had not the princess suddenly remembered her mother and her long anxiety. "But how am I to take you home?" said the prince. "I cannot hide you, and everyone will envy me such a beautiful woman, and try to steal you from me." "I can help you," said the ox, nuzzling the bride affectionately. "I will change the princess into an ugly old man. No one will know her then, and we will travel like the wind." Straightway the princess became a little old man. She and the prince mounted on the back of the fairy ox, and they all flew together over forest, river and mountain for 7 days, till they reached the very door of her mother's home. Then, at last, all was safely over. The shining princess became a bride, and she and her husband went to their own kingdom. They reigned in great peace and happiness, and the fairy ox was their devoted follower and adviser all the days of his life. So ends the story of the Shining Princess. Chapter 5 of Fairy Tales from South Africa, collected and arranged by Mrs E. J. Burhill and Mrs J. B. Drake. The Rabbit Prince, a Shangani tale. Many, many years ago, there lived a rabbit and a duiker who were great friends. The rabbit was cunning and wise beyond all animals. The duiker was just an innocent little antelope who was fond of men, and so never went far from a kraal. One day the rabbit said to the duiker, "Why shouldn't we have lands and grow our own mealies and calabashes, just like the men who live in yonder kraal? I know where there is good ground." The duiker agreed at once, and the two friends had soon chosen their patch of land. They then hoed it well and set their mealies, their calabashes and their groundnuts, just as they had seen them done by the wives of the neighbouring chief. The duiker had the biggest patch, and his mealies were wonderfully tall and fine. When autumn drew near, the rabbit took a bag every day and went to get corn and nuts. But he never got them from his own field, for that still remained untouched. One day the duiker went to see how his crops were getting on, and found a great part of them gone. He instantly suspected the rabbit and accused him of stealing. The rabbit denied the accusation at once with great indignation and said, "I have not touched your lands. The King of Kings has done it, and you will never catch the thief. Then where do you get your mealies? They do not come from your own lands." "What do you suppose we live near a kraal for?" said the rabbit cheerfully. "I eat the chief's mealies." The duiker was much puzzled, especially when he found only a day later that his crops had been attacked again. "I shall soon have nothing left," he said to the rabbit. "Do think of something I can do." "Let us make a trap," said the rabbit. "Perhaps we may catch the thief after all." He took some hairs out of a horse's tail and tied the whole length in a succession of slip knots. Then he laid it on the ground, fixed it with tiny sticks, and sprinkled earth all over so that no one could see the line. Then a few mealies were scattered about lightly, so that birds might be tempted to scratch and entangle their feet in the knots, which would tighten at once when they struggled to free themselves. Next morning the rabbit and the duiker went together to the mealie patch to examine the trap. To their great joy they found a most beautiful bird, held tight by the fine black threads. It had very long wings and was beating them ineffectually in great distress. The rabbit seized the knots with his teeth, while the duiker held the bird. But it was too quick for them. As soon as it felt the knots were loose, it slipped away from the duiker with one stroke of its powerful wings, and soared high up into the clouds. "Never mind," said the rabbit, "we will set the trap again tonight." The next day they found the beautiful bird again caught in the long line of knots. She was not alone, but had with her a great swarm of birds as beautiful as herself. They circled round and round, watching the rabbit and the duiker as they took the culprit and began to untie the knots. This time they were more careful, and their prey had no chance of escape. They carried her to their hut before removing the slip knots, and examined her very carefully. She was very handsome, but the most remarkable thing about her was a very long feather, which was in one wing only. The wise rabbit instantly guessed that this was the source of her strength. He pulled it out, but to his astonishment the bird at once disappeared, and a beautiful princess stood before him. He instantly hid the feather and asked the princess to remain in the hut. He would treat her very well and bring her food every day. So the princess stayed in the hut, for now that she had lost her feather, she could no longer go back to her home in the clouds. The birds flew to the door of the hut every day and asked her when she was coming home again. "Have patience," said the princess, "I will return in good time." "Where is your long feather?" asked the birds. "Have you lost it?" "It is quite safe," said the princess. "The rabbit has put it away." The princess lived thus for many days. The more she saw of the rabbit, the more she admired his wisdom and cunning. What a pity, thought she, that he is only a rabbit. No chief can compare with him in the whole of my father's dominions. And as she was a fairy and had magic power, she determined he should be a rabbit no longer. One day, when the princess and the rabbit were alone, he said to her, "Do you know who took your feather?" "Yes," said the princess, "you took it." "You are quite right," said the rabbit. "Do you know where I put it?" "No," said the princess, "but I am quite sure it is safe with you. Please keep it, but just let me see it for one moment." The rabbit could not resist her. She was so beautiful, so he fetched the feather. The princess took it in her hand, but did not attempt to fly away. She just laughed and threw it at the rabbit. Instantly he became a handsome prince, to the princess's great joy. The rabbit prince himself saw that this made a great change in his prospects. He could now woo the princess as an equal, but he had no lands to give her. Suddenly he remembered the beautiful plot of ground which belonged to the dyker. "I am a man now," said the rabbit. "I will kill the dyker and give his lands to the princess." He lay in wait, slew the little antelope, and brought it home to the hut. They had buck that night for supper, and as they sat eating, he said to the princess, "Come, will you marry me?" The princess said, "Yes, I will indeed, but let us keep it secret. These birds who come from my home must never hear of it, for my parents would never allow me to marry a man from the earth." In the meantime, the birds got tired of waiting for the princess and said to one another, "It is all the fault of the rabbit prince. We must kill him, or the princess will never see home again." They sought counsel with the mouse and the woodpecker, who were reckoned the wisest magicians in the country, and lived near at hand. They told of a safe poison to put in the prince's food. But the princess knew her people well, and warned the prince in good time. He ate nothing and escaped in safety. The mouse and the woodpecker in the meantime became so fond of him they soon refused to do him any harm, and made their home close to his hut, so that they might see him every day. But there came a time when the princess longed to go home again. She said to the prince, "Would you like to see my father and mother?" "Very much," said the prince. "Where are they?" "They live in the sky," said the princess. "Go and fetch me the feather once more." The rabbit prince brought the feather again and gave it to the princess. She set the feather on the ground. It instantly began to grow and became taller and taller, till at last it reached the very clouds. Then they began to climb up. The prince and princess went first, and the mouse and woodpecker followed, for they said they must be with the prince to protect him in case of harm. They climbed and climbed till they were above the clouds. There they came to the mouth of an enormous cave, but it was shut by a great big stone. The princess was in despair. "However can we roll this aside?" she cried. "There is nothing I cannot nibble through," said the mouse. "Let me try for a few minutes." He nibbled hard at the corner of the stone, but had to come back, for he had made no impression whatever. Then the woodpecker stepped forward. "Let me try," said she. "I make my little nest in wood. The crevice my beak cannot enter has yet to be made." She tapped carefully all round the edge of the great stone, and suddenly cried, "This is the way to do it." She had found a tiny swivel on one side of the stone, no longer than your finger. This she pulled, and the stone rolled back, and the cave stood open. The prince was just about to lead his bride in, when a huge monster appeared. On his head were 2 horns, and on each horn was the head of a human being. He had eyes all over his body from head to foot, and every eye glared at the prince with a green light. But the princess just drew out the long feather once more and dug it right into his face, and he vanished away like smoke. "Now," said she, "we can go forward safely." They walked through the cave, and at the other end found an opening which looked out on just such another world as ours. There were wide green valleys and flowing streams, and in front was a big kraal with beautifully woven huts. This was the princess's home, and she ran towards it joyfully. Her father and mother appeared in human form to greet her, and all her friends, whom the prince had only seen as birds, crowded round her as men and women, each more full of rejoicing than the other. "But where did you get this man you have brought with you?" asked her father, when the first greetings were over. "I have stolen him from below," said the princess, laughing merrily. Her father frowned. He had never had anything to do with the inhabitants of earth, and was very angry at the idea of any intercourse with them. When the princess explained that the rabbit prince was her chosen husband, her parents and all her friends were much annoyed, and said that they could never hear of any such marriage. The princess still pleaded hard for her lover. She told her parents of his wisdom and power, and said that no girl ever had so clever or so noble a husband. But the old chief simply replied that no daughter of the clouds had ever married a man from the earth. The prince must be sent back home. But as the princess still clung to the prince and refused to dismiss him, her people decided that he must be killed. A big feast of welcome was arranged, and many days were spent in preparation. The mouse was never far from the cooking pots, and ran in and out all day, picking up savoury morsels. No one saw him, but nothing escaped his little black eyes. On the morning of the feast day, he saw all the food set out in dishes ready for the guests. The prince's portion was placed in 2 little black pots, and decorated with green leaves. When no one was looking, a strangely dressed old woman came up, a witch for certain, and powdered it with some curious stuff, but touched no other pot. Just as the feast was about to open, the mouse crept up to the prince, ran up his back, and whispered in his ear, "Eat none of the food prepared for you. Drink the beer. That is the only safe thing." The prince obeyed, and thus escaped the first danger. But the people of the clouds, much disappointed, assembled all their greatest magicians and made fresh plans. "We will arrange a hailstorm," said these wise men. "Let the prince go out on the great plains tomorrow. We will see he does not come back alive." Next morning the king of the sky sent the rabbit prince on a journey to another kraal across a wide plain. When he had travelled some 3 hours, and was many miles from any shelter, great clouds appeared on the horizon. They were of the deepest blue-black, and every minute they spread farther, till the sun was blotted out. And then, far away, came a distant, continuous rumble of thunder. It never ceased for a moment. The sound was ever sharper and more threatening, and grew closer and closer. "That is not thunder," said the prince. "It is hail, and there is no shelter for miles. I shall never see the princess again." "Do not fear," said a voice at his ear, and he turned and saw the woodpecker. "Lie down on the ground. I will protect your head, for I also am a magician." So the prince lay down, and the little woodpecker spread out her wings and hovered over his head. One great hailstone came as if shot from a gun, then another and another, and then they came in hundreds and thousands, large as fowls' eggs, jagged and icy cold, with a sound like the roar of many torrents over endless precipices. Such a storm as had never been known in Cloudland. When the prince returned unhurt and cheerful, his enemies were dumbfounded and more enraged than ever. But they still persevered. They held a big Ndaba under a shady tree, attended by their chief men and all their magicians. Footnote: Ndaba, a conference or council. End of footnote. A royal hunt was arranged to last for many days. During their absence from the kraal, the prince was to be killed by an assegai, as it were by an accident, for none wanted the princess to think her husband had been murdered. This time they thought they could not fail, for they would be sure to have numberless opportunities in the heat of the chase. But the woodpecker sat unseen in the boughs of the tree and heard everything. She was a wise bird and a great magician, and the instant she understood, she flew to the empty hut of the first wizard of Cloudland, and there made a charm. She took the fat of the mamba, the most deadly of all snakes, the fat of the python, who is the biggest of snakes, and the skin round the lungs of a tiger. These she mixed together and placed in 3 little bags of python skin, such as could easily be hidden. Then she flew straight to the rabbit prince with the bags in her mouth. "Take these," she said, "and wear them always. New dangers threaten you." The prince obeyed and went gaily to the hunt. He was away for many days, and every day some chief attempted his life, but all the assegais fell back powerless. The charms had rendered him invulnerable. He returned home safe and sound, but that evening he told the princess it was useless to struggle any longer. Her people would never rest till they had killed him. The princess listened in sorrow. Then she said, "You are quite right. I had hoped they would see in time how clever and brave you are, but it is no use. We must steal away quickly to earth tonight and seek our fortune below. Call the mouse and the woodpecker while I make the ladder ready." The princess drew out the magic feather and held it point downwards towards the earth. It at once began to grow, and in a few minutes the point rested close to the rabbit prince's hut. Then the 4 friends climbed down and left the land of clouds forever. Next morning they held a council. "Something must be done to find men to serve under us," said the prince. "I want a kingdom and cattle for the princess. She cannot live in a hut alone." "Those 3 little bags will do all you want," said the woodpecker. "You have only to wish, and everything will be given you." "Then," said the prince, "let me have beautiful huts, strong willing maids to wait on the princess, and a wise woman to advise her." Straightway there appeared the most perfect huts you can imagine, filled with everything they could want. 30 strong cheerful girls stood before them, and a dear old queen who knew everything a wise woman should, and had the kindest heart in the world. Then the rabbit prince felt his wife would be safe and well cared for, so he left her under the special protection of the woodpecker, and he and the mouse went forth to seek soldiers and cattle. Nor did they seek in vain. They soon heard of a mighty king who possessed warriors and cattle in thousands. By the power of the little bags the prince overcame him and took all his warriors and cattle back to the princess. Then he established a great kingdom, and to reward his 2 friends he made the mouse a prince and the woodpecker a princess. He gave the mouse soldiers and sent him forth to conquer. I am afraid I have forgotten the adventures of the mouse. All I know is that he became a great chief, and that to this day both he and his wife are devoted to the Rabbit Prince. So ends The Rabbit Prince. Chapter 6 of Fairy Tales from South Africa, collected and arranged by Mrs E. J. Burhill and Mrs J. B. Drake. The Unnatural Mother, a Swazi Tale. Many, many years ago, there lived a bride and bridegroom. Now, among the Kafir people, a newly wedded pair always spend their first year with the bridegroom's mother, for there are many important ceremonies to be completed before the bride can be given a home of her own. So the bride and bridegroom lived in a little hut close to the hut of the old mother. Every day they all went out to hoe their land, on which they grew maize, sugar-cane, pumpkins and calabashes. The calabashes are good to eat when they are green, and when they are ripe the skin becomes quite hard, and they make beautiful drinking vessels. The mother worked at her patch, and the young people at a separate one of their own. And every day before they started, the young wife made beautiful food for her husband, and left it in the hut ready for his return from work, when he would be hungry. There was green mealy porridge flavoured with the juice of sugar-cane, young calabash and spinach, all set out neatly in brown clay pots, and cool native beer in a big calabash. All was made ready for the evening, when they would return and her husband would be hungry. But the old mother saw the beautiful food and longed to have it. So when the young people were hard at work on their patch, she took off her kilt of black ox skins and hung it on the handle of her pick. Then she said to the pick, "Pick, go on working till I return." This the pick obediently did, and thus whenever the son looked towards his mother's patch, someone appeared to be working there. When all seemed in good order, the old mother ran away back to her son's hut, entered in and put on his beautiful kilt of jackal and cat skins, and all his bead ornaments which the bride had made for him. She took, too, his long staff, carved at the head, such as no woman uses, and hung with tails of many animals. In this way she deceived all who passed, and sat down to her meal, singing a gleeful little song to herself. "I am the bridegroom, I wear the bridegroom's clothes, all his beautiful food is for me." Then she sat down and ate up everything. When she had finished, she went back to her mealie patch and hoed busily till it was time to go home. The bride was dreadfully disappointed when she found all the beautiful food gone which she had made for her husband, for she was anxious to show him how clever a cook she was, and so to win the praises of all his family. So the next day she tried again, and did yet better. But in the evening the food had disappeared once more. This happened several days in succession, so at last the bride and bridegroom consulted together, for no one knew who the thief was. "I have a plan," said the bridegroom. "Tomorrow morning you will make the food as usual, and we will start out together very early and say we are going to be out all day. Then, in an hour or two, I will come back secretly and watch by the hut. In that way I shall be sure to catch the thief." So the next morning the bridegroom returned secretly and sat near his hut to see what would happen. He could hardly believe his eyes when he saw his own mother come running back from the field. When he saw her enter the hut, put on his dress and begin to eat his food, his horror was such that he could hardly speak. He rose immediately, went into the hut, and accused her of being the thief. "Alas, it is true," moaned the old mother. "The food was good and I was tempted. What can I do to be forgiven?" "For this crime," said the son, "you deserve to die, for you have sinned against nature. But I will not kill you. Only you must go far away from here and travel into strange countries, and you must never come back till you have found the water in which there are no frogs, no fishes, and no animals of any kind. When you have found it, fill this calabash with it and bring it back to me." So the mother took the calabash and set forth on her journey. She walked for many days over dry and barren country. At last she came to a beautiful clear pool. She went down to the edge of the water and struck it with her staff, crying out, "I have been bidden by my son to find water in which there are no frogs, no fish, and no animals of any kind." Instantly she heard a loud croaking all round the pool, and hundreds of frogs came out to look at her. So then she knew that this was not the promised water. She took up her staff and calabash and journeyed on once more. And after many more days she came to another pool. This was beautifully clear and shone bright blue like the sky itself. But directly she came to the edge and struck it with her staff, hundreds of little silver fishes put their heads out and told her this was not the pool she was seeking. Then she was very sad, and thought she would never see home any more. But she took up her calabash and started again. And after many days of travel in a dry, sandy country, she came to a big forest. Here the trees were very tall, with big glossy green leaves, and underneath were thick bushes all covered with thorns. But the forest was full of little paths, which crossed and recrossed one another, and up and down them passed all kinds of animals. On one side of the forest lay a mountain, and towards this she journeyed. After a long tramp through the bush she reached its foot. There at last she saw the most beautiful water. It fell in a cascade right down the mountainside, and it glittered like the moon. Below it formed a pool clear as crystal, and when the old mother struck it with her staff, there was no sound or ripple. Then she knew she had reached her journey's end. So she sat down to rest under a big tree close to the pool and took snuff. Then she began to observe the animals who went and came busily by many paths. Presently they approached and sniffed at her, and at last they said, "Do you know where you are? This forest and this water belong to a great king. He allows no one even to set foot in it, and if he finds you here, you will die." Then the old mother tried to rise and get away quickly, but she found she could not do it. While she had been sitting down, the limbs of the tree had grown round her and held her fast. She knew then nothing could save her, and burst into tears. In the meantime the animals consulted together as to what could be done for the old woman. The lion, their king, was absent in the depths of the forest, so the elephant spoke first. "We must choose wisely," said he, "for she may help us all. Let the giraffe protect her. His neck is so long that he can see through the trees easily." But the giraffe refused, and suggested that the tiger was better. He was so strong and his claws so sharp that no one under his care could be touched. "That is quite true at night," said the tiger, "but in the day I sit with my eyes half closed and see nothing. No, let the rabbit be sent. His eyes are large and bright, and no one in all the forest is half so clever as he." The rabbit consented, and went up to the old mother, saying, "Dear old mother, why are you crying?" "I am crying," she answered, "because I shall never see my home again. I stole my child's food, and can never be forgiven till I have found water in which there are no frogs, no fish, and no animals of any kind. Here I have found the water, but the tree has grown round me, and I cannot move." "I will help you," said the rabbit. He set to work at once with his pretty little teeth, and soon he had nibbled through the branches which grew round her, and she stood upright again. Then he filled her calabash from the pool and said, "Get out of the forest as fast as ever you can, before the king sees you, and go straight home. Do not stop to thank me. Your escape will bring us great good fortune." The old mother took the water and hastened away. After many days she reached home and gave the water to her son. At that very moment the forest behind her disappeared, and all the animals in it. Instead appeared a big, big town full of people. All the little paths became winding streets, and the trees became beautiful round huts woven with great skill. The animals became men and women who lived happily together in peace and plenty. Many years before, a wicked enchanter had bewitched them, and they had been freed by the old mother who had carried the water to her son. As for her, she was forgiven and awarded every honour in her own home. So ends The Unnatural Mother.